What's up guys, DK here with Collector's Impact, and today we're going to have a nice candid discussion about the concept of hoarding versus collecting. Now, as a collector for many years, this is something that has kind of plagued my psyche quite a bit, and I'm sure that I'm not alone there, so I wanted to go ahead and share my personal philosophy on this in 8 easy-to-follow bullet points. So with that said, of course, this is just my personal take. This is not 100% fact or whatnot. This is a discussion video, and I'm very much interested to see what you guys think about this subject. But with many years of doing this, this is what I find to be the most pertinent when trying to judge if you're being a hoarder versus being an actual collector, and how to walk that fine line and or how to step back from the edge, if you know what I mean. Alright, so for point number 1, this really comes down to personal philosophy. So when it comes to being a hoarder versus being a collector, there are all types of different viewpoints from a philosophical standpoint on what that actually means. Now, there's an actual literal definition of what a hoarder is that you can find in Webster's dictionary, and that is defined as a persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions because of a perceived need to save them. Yeah, and guess what, guys? A synonym for a hoarder, it has in the dictionary as collector, which that's why we're having this video, because they are quite different. But, of course, back to point number 1, it comes down to personal philosophy. Some people are into the whole feng shui elements of keeping their house in perfect, clean order with lots of floor space, all that kind of stuff, lots of room for the chi and energy to flow throughout your house with little or no clutter. That's kind of a thing. Then, of course, there's the minimalist approach, which, let's be real, if you're watching this video, if we're talking about like collectibles of any nature, really, you're not necessarily a minimalist. That's a very different kind of mindset. So I would say that most of us probably fall within this realm that I've defined as the tchotchke type's personality and the clutter bug personality. So the tchotchke type personality is one who is, you're a person that's okay with having little knickknacks and little things around the house for fun, because it's enjoyable. It's a hobby, you're a collector. And then, of course, there's the clutter bug, which, as a general rule, the clutter bug is kind of disorganized. You probably got a messy desk. You've got, stuff jammed into the corner of your room in a couple boxes, stuff like that. But overall, we're not talking hoarder level where there's like boxes from floor to ceiling against the wall. If you are at that level, I'll go ahead and say at point number 1, that's definitely hoarding. So that's something to consider right there. And in order to walk back from that line, it comes down to balancing the collection, which we'll of course get into. So point number 2, when considering hoarding versus collecting, is the reason for your collection. Why is it that you are collecting? Is it because you're a hobbyist or enthusiast of the items that you're collecting? So you like vintage video games, so you want to have a lot of vintage video games. And of course, as a true collector, you want to have unique and or historically relevant, titles like The Legend of Zelda. That's why it's here in the original box with the manual and whatever. So that's a collector piece, but that would fall under the hobbyist enthusiast, in my opinion at least. And then you have the investor class. Now, the investor class probably goes by different rules when it comes to what hoarding is, because they're not necessarily in it for the enjoyability of the items, though, of course, most of us are going to have a combination of collector and investor in our mindset for the majority of the things that we're going after. But if you're talking purely investment strategy, that's a different topic, and that comes down to space utilization entirely. So point number 3 to consider is the types of collectibles that you are collecting. So like I mentioned here, of course, you've got the most common types of collectors would be like video game collectors, card collectors, figurine and or action figure collectors, toys, pezzes, things of that nature, Beanie Babies, whatever you want to say. If it's a physical item that's like not flat and boxy, I'd put it in that category. So of course, when you're talking about the type of collector that you are, say for example that you are a card collector, you're going to have a much easier time walking back and or never getting to the line of hoarder that you will if say that you're a collector of packaged action figures, because packaged action figures take up a ton of space. They really do. I have a small collection of them, and I've kept it that way on purpose because they just take up so much space. So if you're a card collector, yeah, they're really flat, really easy to deal with, but they certainly have their problems as well, which we're going to get into. All right, now the fourth thing to consider when you're talking about if you're a hoarder versus collector and where you are on that line is the space utilized as a percentage of your total living space that is dedicated to your collectibles. Really, this ties into number one as well, because it's philosophical on what you find acceptable versus not acceptable. But in my personal opinion here, as this is an opinion-based discussion, I would say that if you have 25% or more of your living space dedicated to collectibles, that is definitely questionable at best. However, it also really does come down to what type of living situation you have, how well off you are, what type of square footage your apartment or house is, if you have storage units, all that kind of stuff plays into it big time. So I guess in terms of that percentage, I'm just talking about your abode, where you rest at night, where you rest your weary head. That matters, in terms of like if a quarter of your living space or more is taken up by collectibles. However you happen to define that, I don't mean necessarily covering every square inch of your house, you know what I mean, with 25% of it. I'm talking however you define 25% of your living space being occupied by your collectibles or more. You might want to consider cutting back a little bit. But if you have like a bunch of extra space, say you're Richie Rich and you've got 10 bedrooms, then whatever, you know what I mean? 25% of that's a heck of a lot more than 25% of a 1,000 square foot apartment or 1,500 square foot home or whatever. You see what I'm saying here? So in terms of raw quantity of the collectibles, it varies a lot based on the lifestyle of the person. So it really comes down to the percentage of the total, space in your abode that it takes up. Now, number 5 is a huge one for me in this discussion, and that is bulk versus the gold items. And of course, what I mean by that is if your collection primarily consists of random common cards or random things that hold little to no value, that's where the problem most starts to come and rear its ugly head. Yeah, so me personally, when it comes to hoarding versus collecting, a lot of it really does come down to bulk versus the actual good items. If your collection consists of, I would say, 90% or more bulk, then you probably have to consider scaling it back. At least in my personal opinion. Again, that comes down to your personal philosophy and the reason that you're collecting in the first place. If you enjoy a bunch of random items, like a bunch of random common cards, you like flipping through them, you like playing games with the commons, or you like a bunch of random non-key issue comic books and you enjoy that and it's part of your collection, then okay, to each their own. Then it comes down to the physical space that it takes up. But I would say as a general rule, if 90% of a collection is bulk and kind of not financially worth anything, then it's definitely teetering on that point of hoarding versus collecting. And this segues into point number 6, which is the amount of wealth, the amount of your actual wealth tied up in the collectible items that you have in your collection. So again, this is a personal thing. You can feel free to agree or disagree with this one, but I would say if you have 25% or more of your wealth tied up in collectibles, that's kind of pushing that limit as well. And I'm talking in terms of everything: your real estate, your car, your bank accounts, your stocks, whatever it is. If that plus your collectibles, if the collectibles equals 25% or more, so if it's like 30%, 50%, freaking 70%, 100% of your wealth is tied up in collectibles, then you might want to consider scaling back and doing some diversification. Again, not financial advice, nothing like that. This is philosophical and discussional in nature, but I'm just saying 25% or more is kind of where I would start assessing at least, which when you combine that with some of the earlier points, looking mostly at something like the value of the collectibles, bulk versus gold, for example, If 25% of your wealth is tied up and you have a collection that's 90% bulk, you can see how those things combined are going to equal a lot of physical space being occupied. Now, number 7 is probably the most important point when it comes to a collector versus a hoarder in the realm of collectibles, and that is asset real estate. And what I mean by this is the space in your house or the space in where you are storing your collectibles is valuable. The same concept applies to any sort of retail store or anything that requires physical storage of space, or even real estate itself. Location, 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 as they always say. So the asset real estate value of your collectibles is a key determining factor on if you're getting into hoarder territory or not, because if you're collecting a bunch of stuff that essentially is taking up valuable space, valuable room that could be utilized for other purposes, that's really it. That's what you have to determine. In terms of really coming up with a strategy around your asset real estate, which collectibles are worth holding on to versus not. If it's a desired item, if it's something that everybody in that space or a lot of people in that space would actually value, now whether that means value for a financial value or value for a collector value with little financial reward, it doesn't matter. You see, it matters that it's valued as a collectible piece and that people see the value in owning the item, and therefore it's asset real estate to be in your collection, to take up room on your shelf, to take up room in your closet. Wherever it's taking up room, it has reason to be doing that. So on the table here, we have quite a few examples of things like that. I would say that the original Legend of Zelda on NES and the original box with the manual and everything, that has valuable asset real estate. If that is sitting on a shelf, that's a fine item to have on a shelf from now until the day that I pass away, simply because it is so iconic. It has such a strong fan base, and collectors of video games or items of this nature would like that item. It's something that any regular collector, I'll just say, in the space of video games would be like, oh yeah, cool, that's a staple collectible. Whereas if you have a bunch of bulk common cards from the Pokemon collector set, it's okay, it's cool, it has its purpose. But in terms of asset real estate and what else you could be placing where you have this, if you exceed in some of the other bullet points, that is, if you exceed in having too much space utilized for things that aren't really worth that much, those are the types of easy ways to identify what items to get rid of versus what items to keep and add to. And also, with that said, this is part of the fun when it comes to collectibles. This is part of the whole fun of the hobby, is that certain things don't always have apparent asset real estate value. You have to think outside the box for certain things. I mean, now this one isn't thinking too far outside the box, but we'll use this MetaZoo Cryptid Nation first edition booster box as an example. It's a new product, 2021. It's, readily available right now, but having that in your collection is it's more in the realm of speculation and whatnot in terms of the potential that product has in the future. But there's a reason that it's there, even if it's not apparent to everyone in the world. And as a collector, trying to find that thin line to walk in terms of what is worth holding and why is really the challenge and the fun of being a collector. And to wrap up the conversation, the 8th and final point, maintaining a well-balanced collection is pretty key in terms of walking that fine line between being a hoarder and being a collector. So, of course, you want to keep a reasonable amount of bulk, and you don't want to go too heavy. My honest opinion would be maybe keeping it 50-50, if not a little less, you know what I mean, in terms of just bulk versus the actual good collectibles that you have for collectible reasons. Bulk is the real thing that is the biggest drain on a person's space and really pushes them into the realm of hoarding. So really, the takeaway from the video, but also there's lots of other nuggets in here, so I hope that you enjoyed it. But the takeaway is, if you got a lot of bulk that is worthless and that has the likelihood of never becoming worth anything, it's probably safe to cut ties with it. I'd say go through some of it, choose out your favorite cards, like You like the Pokemon Vanillite, that's one of your favorites, that's cool. You set that card aside and get rid of the rest. You know what I mean? Here's some Jigglypuff. Everybody likes Jigglypuff. So you just find this Jigglypuff and his cute little field of flowers there, and you're like, oh yeah, that's awesome. Boom, you keep that, throw out the rest. Not necessarily throw out, you know what I mean, guys? Sell the rest, give it away to some kids. You know, make use of it. Start other people in the hobbies and whatnot. It's a great way to get people into a hobby. So if you have friends or family, especially young people in your family, whether they're your own children or other people's children, your nieces, nephews, whatever it is, giving them some of your collectibles that you enjoyed as a kid, especially if it's in the category of bulk, is a great way to introduce a new generation to the joy of collecting. Spreading the love, spreading the hobby to new people by trimming down on your own excessiveness in your own personal collection is a win-win for everybody. As they grow up and they advance their collection, they can do the exact same thing. And it's the cycle of collectibles. The circle of life and collectibles. But yeah, it's all about balancing your collection, keeping a reasonable amount of bulk, keeping a reasonable amount of speculative items. Keep the things that you purely enjoy. Just because it's worthless doesn't mean that it doesn't have value, as mentioned here with the Jigglypuff or anything else. Keep what you enjoy. And most importantly, keep your valuable items. Keep the ones that are going to be iconic home run hitters for a lifetime. Keep those. If you're not heavily invested in them, especially if they're not breaking the other rule of more than 25% of your wealth kind of situation, those are the types of items that you want to have in a collection for many, many different reasons, which I'm sure you can use your imagination as to why. All right, guys. Well, that wraps up the video for today. I hope that you enjoyed this discussion on whether you're teeter-tottering on the line of being a hoarder or a collector or not. You know, let me know where you fall in this realm. Do you think that you're like on the border? Are you doing pretty good? Do you feel like you've got a good grasp on all of these concepts, or is there one in particular that keeps tripping you up? For me personally, it really does come down to like bulk and speculative items. I'll just go ahead and throw that out there. Those are the hardest things to kind of taper back on, simply because you don't necessarily know what's going to be very valuable in the future, but you do know, as a general rule, what's not as well. So I'm personally trying to get a lot better at that, and I hope that you guys are as well. So I can't tell you how many coworkers I've given like Pokemon cards and Magic cards and stuff to them to give to their kids. So just, yeah, reiterating that if you've got bulk, passing it down to younger generations, even if they're completely unrelated to you, no fee, no money, just do it. It's a good thing. Anyway, thanks again for coming by and checking out this video, guys. I do really appreciate it. If you want to see more stuff like this in the future, of course, subscribe. But other than that, I just hope to see you back next time. Take care.